She had been married for 14 months and had never been kissed by her husband. Clara lived in a $1 million penthouse in Manhattan, wore designer clothes, and dined at the finest restaurants, but she was completely invisible to Preston, her billionaire husband. Until the night she simply disappeared. She left only a note and her wedding ring on the dresser. That's when he discovered you only miss the light when it goes out. If you're already curious to know what happened, give this a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Stories like this need to be shared, and your support makes all the difference. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors that Clara had learned to navigate in silence. She stood at the kitchen counter, her fingers wrapped around a porcelain cup that cost more than most people's monthly rent, watching steam rise from the untouched coffee. The silence here wasn't golden. It was suffocating, heavy with the weight of 14 months of carefully orchestrated indifference. "Good morning," she offered softly when Preston entered, his movements precise and calculated as always. He was already dressed in his charcoal suit, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in clipped tones about quarterly reports and acquisition deals. His eyes passed over her briefly, a polite acknowledgement, nothing more, before he made his way to the espresso machine with the efficiency of someone who had mastered the art of existing in the same space without truly sharing it. Clara studied his profile, searching for any crack in the perfectly composed facade. At 44, Preston Ashford commanded boardrooms with the same cold authority he brought to his morning routine. His dark hair was already perfectly styled, his jaw cleanly shaven, his presence filling the room without ever really touching her world. She wondered, not for the first time, if he ever looked at her and saw anything beyond the contractual obligation she represented. "The charity gala is tonight," she ventured, setting down her cup with deliberate care. "The one for childhood literacy. I thought maybe we could—" "I'll meet you there," he interrupted, ending his call and pocketing the phone. "The car picks you up at 7. His tone was the same one he used with his assistants, professional, distant, final. Clara nodded, swallowing the words that wanted to spill out. Words like "maybe we could go together," or "I'd love to know what you think I should wear," or even "do you remember why we support this cause?" But she had learned the boundaries of their arrangement, written not in the legal contract locked away in his office, but in the careful choreography of their daily interactions. The contract had been clear from the beginning, a marriage of convenience, nothing more. Her mother's medical bills, mounting like storm clouds over the modest family home in Brooklyn, needed a solution that Clara's freelance income couldn't provide. The family house, 3 generations of memories built into its worn walls, was days away from foreclosure when Preston's lawyer presented the offer. "Miss Clara Romano," the lawyer had said, his voice carrying the weight of both salvation and surrender in equal measure. "My client requires a wife for social and business purposes. The arrangement would be mutually beneficial." She had said yes not out of love or even hope, but out of desperation wrapped in dignity. Preston needed someone refined enough for his social circle, intelligent enough to hold conversations at corporate events, and undemanding enough to accept the emotional vacuum he offered in return. Clara needed security, medical coverage for her mother, and the kind of financial stability that would let her sleep at night without calculating how many freelance articles she'd need to write to keep the lights on. Now, watching him check his Rolex with the same attention he never gave her, Clara felt the familiar hollow ache settle in her chest. The penthouse around them was a monument to wealth without warmth, designer furniture that belonged in a museum, art that impressed visitors but revealed nothing about the people who lived there, rooms that echoed with the absence of genuine laughter or spontaneous conversation. "Preston," she called softly as he headed for the door, briefcase in hand. He paused, turning back with eyebrows slightly raised in polite inquiry. "My mother is doing better. The new treatment is working." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, that she had shared something personal, or maybe mild irritation that she had interrupted his exit routine. "That's good to hear," he replied, the words technically appropriate but emotionally hollow. "I'm glad the medical coverage is proving adequate." Medical coverage. Not, "I'm so happy your mother is getting better," or "you must be relieved," or even "send her my regards." just acknowledgement of a contractual provision being satisfactorily fulfilled. Clara watched him leave, the sound of his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble, until the elevator doors closed with a whispered finality. Then she was alone again in her palace of beautiful emptiness, surrounded by luxury that felt more like a prison with 1,000 thread-count bars. She moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass as she looked down at the city waking up. Somewhere down there, people were fighting and making up, sharing coffee and dreams, touching each other without contracts governing the terms of their affection. Somewhere down there, her old life waited like a book she had closed mid-chapter. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, a woman who had learned to dress in designer clothes but felt like she was wearing a costume, who attended galas and gallery openings but felt more like a beautiful accessory than a participant. At 42, Clara thought she understood loneliness. She had spent years as a single woman, writing stories about love while wondering if it would ever find her. But this was different. This was loneliness amplified by proximity, isolation intensified by the presence of someone who shared her bed, but never her dreams. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had married a man to save her family's home, only to discover that home had nothing to do with marble countertops or Manhattan addresses. Home should be where someone noticed when you were quiet, where your morning coffee routine mattered to someone besides yourself, where your presence was wanted instead of simply tolerated. But tonight would be like every other night. She would wear the sapphire dress he had never complimented, arrive at the gala with perfect posture and a rehearsed smile, and play the role of Mrs. Preston Ashford while her husband conducted business disguised as socializing. And when they returned home, he would disappear into his study with the words, "Good night, Clara." Polite, appropriate, and completely empty of anything that resembled intimacy. Clara counted the days like someone counting absences. Sitting in the grey velvet armchair that cost more than her entire old apartment in Queens, she watched the hours pass on the Swiss clock that decorated the living room wall. 3:15 in the afternoon. Preston wouldn't be back before 9, maybe 10. 6 more hours of elegant silence, 6 more hours of being a ghost in her own life. She flipped through a decorating magazine without really seeing the pages, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the soft fabric of the cushion beside her. Everything here was perfect. The fresh flowers that the housekeeper changed twice a week, the natural light filtering through imported silk curtains, the subtle lavender scent that lingered in the air thanks to strategically placed diffusers. It was like living inside a luxury department store display window, beautiful to admire, impossible to feel at home in. The phone rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. Clara startled, hopeful for a moment, before seeing the name on the screen. Assistant, Preston Ashford. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Ashford," came Margaret's professional voice, Preston's personal assistant. "Mr. Ashford asked me to confirm that you'll be ready at 7 for tonight's event. The Valentino dress arrived this morning and is in the closet." "Thank you, Margaret," Clara replied, her voice coming out softer than intended. "Is there anything specific Preston would like me to know about the event?" A hesitant pause. "Well, ma'am, there are some important Japanese investors attending. Mr. Ashford mentioned it would be helpful if you could discuss contemporary art. They're collectors." Clara closed her eyes. Of course. She wasn't invited as a wife, but as a decorative piece that could also be useful for business. "I see. Anything else?" "No, ma'am. Mr. Ashford said he trusts your good judgment." After she hung up, Clara remained motionless in the chair, feeling the familiar weight of irrelevance settling on her shoulders. Trusts your good judgment. As if she were a competent employee, not the woman who slept beside him every night, separated by an emotional distance that seemed to grow each day. She stood and walked to the panoramic window that offered a stunning view of Central Park. Down below, people jogged along the paths, families picnicked, couples walked hand in hand. Real life, happening right there, while she watched from her ivory tower. Her memories drifted to the last event they'd attended together, a gala for cancer research the previous week. She had chosen an emerald green dress that brought out her eyes, had spent an hour styling her hair in soft waves that framed her face. When she came down the penthouse stairs, Preston looked at her for exactly 3 seconds before checking his watch. "You're on time," he had commented, as if that was all that mattered. During the event, Clara watched other couples. She saw how James Morrison whispered something in his wife's ear that made her laugh, how she adjusted his tie intimately before he went up on stage. She saw how David Chen kept his hand on his wife's back as they walked through the room, a protective and caring gesture that spoke of years of genuine connection. And then there were she and Preston, two well-dressed strangers who moved through the crowd like actors following a script. He introduced her with pride, "My wife, Clara," but in the same way he would introduce a new car or a successful business acquisition, something that reflected well on his status, not someone he actually knew or valued. "Clara, darling." Vivian Hartford's shrill voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find her penthouse neighbor, a socialite in her 60s, who survived on gossip and champagne. "How are you? I didn't see you at the spa this week." "Hi, Vivian." Clara forced a smile. "I've been busy with some projects." "Projects?" Vivian raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "What kind of projects?" Clara hesitated. How to explain that she had tried to get back to writing, but the words came out forced and lifeless? How to admit that she had lost the voice that once brought passionate characters to life and created stories that made readers cry? "Charity work mostly," she lied, because it was easier than the truth. Oh, how wonderful. Preston must be so proud. Men like him appreciate wives who keep themselves busy with appropriate causes. Vivian took a sip of what appeared to be her third martini of the day. "You two are the perfect couple, you know. So elegant together, so coordinated." Coordinated. The word echoed in Clara's mind long after Vivian left in search of more gossip and alcohol. That was exactly what they were. Coordinated, matched, but never connected. She went back inside the penthouse, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. She passed Preston's study, the door always closed, the guest rooms that never received real guests, the formal dining room where they ate in silence when they ate together, which was rare. In the shared closet, though Preston was rarely there at the same time as her, Clara found the Valentino dress. It was stunning as always, midnight blue silk with subtle embroidery that cost more than most people's annual salary. She held it against her body, watching her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back was beautiful, elegant, perfectly put together. But her eyes told a different story. They spoke of a woman who was slowly disappearing inside, who was becoming more transparent each day. She spent pretending to be happy in a marriage that was more performance than partnership. She remembered when she was younger, working in her small Queens apartment, writing until the early hours, passionate about every sentence she created. Her writer friends used to gather at the corner cafe, debating literature, sharing dreams, laughing until their stomachs hurt. When was the last time she had laughed like that? When was the last time she had felt truly alive? The sound of the elevator made her jump. Preston was home early, which was unusual. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, the familiar sequence of sounds, keys hitting the entry table, briefcase being set down, the light sigh of someone unwinding from a long day. "Clara," his voice echoed through the apartment. "Here," she replied, stepping out of the closet. He appeared in the bedroom doorway, tie loosened but still impeccably groomed. "How was your day?" he asked, the question sounding more like protocol than genuine interest. "Quiet," she replied, because it was true, and because he didn't really want to know about the loneliness consuming her, about how she had spent 20 minutes looking at an old photo of her family in Brooklyn, missing a time when her laughter echoed through the walls of a house where she was truly wanted. "Good," he said, already heading for the bathroom. "Are you ready for tonight?" And there it was, the complete extent of their marital intimacy. Questions about event preparation, not about feelings or dreams or anything that actually mattered. Later, as she prepared for another night of acting, Clara wondered if it was possible to die of loneliness, even while surrounded by luxury. If it was possible to gradually disappear, becoming a shadow of yourself, until one day you looked in the mirror and saw nothing but the emptiness your life had become. The sound of the espresso machine cut through the morning air like a metronome, marking another day in Preston Ashford's perfectly timed life. Clara watched his economical movements, each gesture calculated for maximum efficiency. 2 sugars, 1 precise measure of milk, exactly 3 minutes to review emails on his phone, while the drink cooled to the ideal temperature. "Preston," she tried, her voice gently cutting through the silence. "I thought maybe we could take a walk in Central Park today. The weather is perfect and—" "I have a meeting with the Japanese at 9, he replied without looking up from the screen, his fingers scrolling quickly through messages, "and lunch with Henderson at 12:15. Then I need to review the merger reports." Clara nodded, swallowing the disappointment that had become as familiar as the taste of morning coffee. "Maybe tomorrow then." "Tomorrow is Saturday. Flight to London at 7 p.m. He finally looked up but was already moving toward the door. "Back Monday." 3 days, she murmured, more to herself than to him. "What?" "Nothing. Have a good trip." He stopped for a moment, and Clara felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he had heard something in her voice. Maybe he would finally notice the melancholy she could no longer hide. But Preston simply checked his watch and nodded briefly before disappearing into the private elevator. Clara remained in the kitchen for long minutes after he left, listening to the echo of her own heartbeat in the silence that followed. She had become an expert at measuring her life by the spaces between his words, by pauses that never turned into questions about how she was feeling. The following Tuesday, she tried a different approach. She spent the morning researching contemporary art galleries, memorizing names of emerging artists and market trends. When Preston came home, she was waiting in the living room with 2 glasses of wine and carefully organized information about an exhibition at the Whitney Museum. "How was your day?" she asked, offering him the wine. "Productive," he replied, accepting the glass but remaining standing, as if already planning his escape to the study. Fourth quarter numbers exceeded expectations. "That's wonderful," Clara smiled, trying to inject genuine enthusiasm into her voice. "I heard about a fascinating exhibition at the Whitney. Yuki Tanaka is showing a series about urban transformations. I thought maybe, considering your Japanese investors, it might be interesting for us to check it out together. This weekend, perhaps?" Preston took a sip of wine, his eyes already wandering to the phone buzzing discreetly in his pocket. "Tanaka? Yes, I've heard of him. Good potential investment." He pulled out his phone, glancing quickly at the screen. "Sorry, this is urgent." "Tokyo." And so another attempt at connection became another conversation, interrupted by obligations that always seemed more urgent than the woman who shared his home. On Thursday, Clara woke up with a different idea. If he couldn't disconnect from work, maybe she could connect through it. She spent the day studying Preston's companies, memorizing annual reports, understanding mergers and acquisitions. When he came home, she was ready. "Preston, I read about the TechFlow acquisition. Fascinating vertical diversification strategy," she began, using the technical terms she had memorized. "It must have been a complex negotiation." He paused, actually paused, and for a moment, Clara thought she had found the key. "It was," he admitted, sitting down for the first time in weeks to talk with her. Henderson was skeptical about the growth projections, but the Asian market data was compelling. Clara leaned forward, encouraged. "And the team integration. I imagine that's one of the biggest challenges in this type of operation." "Exactly." Preston took another sip of wine, seeming slightly surprised by her insight. "Their corporate culture is completely different from ours. We'll need at least 6 months to align processes." For 15 precious minutes they talked. Actually talked. Clara asked intelligent questions. Preston offered detailed answers, and for a brief moment she felt like a partner, not just an ornamental wife, until his phone rang. Ashford. His posture changed immediately, back to executive mode. "Yes, I'm aware of the situation. No, this can't wait until tomorrow." He stood up, covering the phone with his hand. "Sorry, Clara. Crisis with the European suppliers." And so, the most promising connection they'd had in months evaporated like steam, leaving Clara alone in the room with 2 glasses of wine and the growing feeling that she was trying to build a bridge to someone who had already moved to a different city. On Saturday, she decided to try one last approach. If she couldn't reach him through shared interests or professional conversations, maybe she could touch him through vulnerability. When he returned from his morning run, a rigorously solitary activity, she was in the kitchen preparing eggs Benedict, his favorite dish that she had learned to make by watching YouTube videos. "Smells good," he commented, seeming genuinely surprised. "I remembered you like it," Clara said, serving the plate with studied care. "I thought we could have breakfast together before you leave for the office." Preston hesitated, looking at his phone, then at her, then at the perfectly prepared plate. "I have some emails to—" "Preston," she interrupted gently, and something in her voice must have alerted him because he actually looked into her eyes for the first time in days. "I know we're busy, that our life is complicated, but sometimes I feel like we're becoming strangers who share the same address." He paused, fork in the air, and Clara saw a moment of something, guilt, recognition, pass across his features. "Clara, you don't have to say anything," she hurried to add, not wanting to break the fragile moment. "I just wanted you to know that I'm here. That when you want to talk, or just be together without doing anything in particular, I'm here." Preston lowered his fork, and for a moment Clara thought he would say something meaningful, something that acknowledged the growing distance between them, something that suggested he too felt the loneliness that hung over their apartment like persistent fog. Instead, he briefly touched her hand, the first voluntary physical contact in weeks, and said, "You're a good wife, Clara. I appreciate everything you do to keep our life running." A good wife. The words echoed in her mind long after he left for the office, leaving half his breakfast on the plate and a vague promise that they would try to have dinner together during the week. That night, Clara lay in the king-size bed they shared, but which felt like an ocean of cold silk between them. Preston was in his study, light still on under the door, the soft sound of keys being typed leaking through the walls. She stared at the ceiling, counting the hours until he would come to bed silently, on the other side of the mattress, careful not to touch her even accidentally. And that's when Clara realized she had become an expert at loving someone who was always in the same room but never really present, always too busy to notice that she was slowly disappearing right there beside him. The night of the charity event arrived wrapped in a fog of expectation that Clara couldn't quite define. Maybe it was the way the golden sunset light filtered through the silk curtains, or the fact that Preston had cancelled only 2 work calls instead of his usual 5, but something in the air felt different, charged with possibilities. Clara chose the sapphire blue dress with extra care, letting the silk flow through her fingers before putting it on. In the mirror, she saw a version of herself she still recognized, elegant, sophisticated, but with a sparkle in her eyes that had been absent for months. Maybe it was time. Maybe tonight would be when she finally managed to reach the man she had married. "You look beautiful," Preston said when she came down the stairs, and the words made her heart race until she realized he was typing on his phone as he spoke, his eyes never actually landing on her. "Thank you," she replied, waiting for him to put away his phone, to really look at her, to maybe even comment on how the blue brought out her eyes or how she had styled her hair differently. But Preston was already heading for the door, checking his watch with the precision of a man for whom punctuality was a cardinal virtue. In the car, Clara tried to break the ice. "I read about the organization we're supporting tonight. Their work with adult literacy is really inspiring, especially the program for single mothers who—" Preston murmured, still absorbed in his screen. "Sorry, Clara. The Shanghai numbers just came in." Clara leaned back into the soft leather seat, watching the city lights pass by the window. Every attempt at connection was like trying to light a match in the wind, a brief flicker of hope before darkness returned. The event hall was stunning, decorated with white and gold flower arrangements, hundreds of elegantly dressed people circulating with champagne glasses. Clara knew this dance: smile, greet, make small talk about worthy causes, while the men discussed business and the women compared jewelry and travel destinations. "Preston, Clara!" Margaret Whitfield's shrill voice reached them through the crowd. "You look absolutely stunning. As always, the perfect couple." Clara smiled politely as Margaret air-kissed her cheeks. "Margaret, so good to see you." "I heard you're considering a house in the Hamptons for the summer," Margaret continued, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of fresh gossip. "Is it true?" Clara blinked, surprised. This was the first she'd heard of any house in the Hamptons. She looked at Preston, who maintained his neutral business expression. "We're still exploring options," he replied diplomatically, and Clara felt the familiar pang of exclusion, another decision about their lives that he was considering without consulting her. The evening progressed in its predictable choreography. Preston was pulled into conversations about investments and market opportunities, while Clara found herself doing what she always did, being the charming wife who complimented his image without ever really being included in important decisions. It was during the break between dinner and the auctions that Clara made an impulsive decision. Seeing Preston momentarily alone on the terrace, checking messages, she approached with renewed determination. "Preston," she said, lightly touching his arm. "Do you have a minute?" He looked up, and for the first time that evening, his eyes actually focused on her. "Sure. What's up?" Clara took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air in her lungs. "I was thinking, when was the last time we did something together? I mean really together. No phones, no work, just the two of us." Preston frowned, as if she had asked a particularly complex question about corporate mergers. "Well, we're here together now." "That's not what I mean," Clara continued, her voice gaining urgency. "I mean something like, do you remember when we were newlyweds and you mentioned you'd always wanted to visit Tuscany? What if we planned a trip? Just a few days, away from everything. We could visit wineries, explore small towns." "Tuscany," he repeated, as if the word were foreign. "Clara, you know how the market is right now. The TechFlow merger is still in negotiations, and the London investors will be there when we get back," Clara interrupted gently. "Preston, when you look at me, what do you see?" The question caught him off guard. He blinked, clearly uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. "I see my wife, an intelligent, elegant woman who..." "Who what?" Clara pressed, taking a step closer. "Finish the sentence." Preston was quiet for a long moment, and Clara could see the gears of his mind working, searching for the appropriate answer, one that would satisfy without compromising. "Who enriches my life?" he said finally. The words were pretty, technically correct, completely empty of real emotion. Clara felt something break inside her, a small hope she had kept alive, dying definitively. "How?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do I enrich your life, Preston? When was the last time you asked about my day and actually waited for the answer? When was the last time we shared a laugh? Or you noticed when I changed my hair, or you simply hugged me without it being a social obligation?" Preston looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional intensity of the conversation in a public setting. "Clara, maybe we should discuss this at home. At home you'll have an urgent call or emails to answer, or reports to review," Clara said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "There's always something more important." "My work is important," Preston replied, his voice gaining a defensive edge. "It's what allows us to have the life we have." "What life?" Clara asked, and the question came out loaded with such deep sadness that it made Preston take a step back. "Preston, we don't have a life. We have a shared schedule. We have a common address. We have appearances to maintain. But life, real life, when was the last time you touched me without it being to pose for a photo?" The silence that followed was deafening. Clara could hear the soft music coming from the ballroom, the murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, the entire soundtrack of an active social life happening meters away while her marriage crumbled on the terrace. "Clara," Preston began, but his voice sounded like a man searching for the right words to end a difficult meeting. "If you could go anywhere in the world right now," Clara said, ignoring his attempt to speak, "where would you go?" I don't understand the relevance of the question." "Answer anyway." Preston hesitated, clearly confused about where she was going with this. "Maybe Singapore? There are interesting investment opportunities in clean technology." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the night breeze on her face. Even in his fantasies, he chose work. "I would go to a small town on the Italian coast," she said softly. "I'd rent a room in an inn with a view of the sea, wake up early to watch the sunrise, drink strong coffee from an unpretentious cup, write stories about real people with real problems and real love." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "Do you see the difference, Preston? You dream about business opportunities. I dream about life." Preston remained silent, his face a mask of careful control. Clara waited, giving him one last chance to say something. Anything that suggested he understood what she was trying to communicate. "Maybe we should go back," he said finally. "People will start wondering where we are." And there it was. His concern wasn't about what she was feeling, but about appearances, about what others would think if they noticed the perfect couple had disappeared for a serious conversation. Clara nodded slowly, feeling something essential solidify inside her, a cold crystalline clarity about exactly where she stood on her husband's priority list, and it wasn't even close to the top. "So of course," she said, her voice returning to the polite, controlled tone she had perfected over the past 14 months. "We wouldn't want people to realize the perfect couple has imperfections." They returned to the ballroom together, and to any observer they looked exactly like what they had always looked like. Elegant, coordinated, impeccable. But Clara knew that something had changed irreversibly in that conversation on the terrace. She had stopped waiting for crumbs of attention and started accepting that maybe she deserved the whole loaf. 3 days after the charity event, Clara woke up with a strange feeling. Something between nostalgia and rebellion, as if a dormant part of herself was finally stretching after a long hibernation. Preston had already left for the office, leaving only the lingering scent of his expensive aftershave and the still warm impression of where he had slept, carefully maintaining his half of the king-size bed. Clara lay still for long minutes, staring at the ornate plaster ceiling that had cost more than many people earn in a year. For 14 months, she had woken up in this luxurious bed, feeling like a stranger in her own life. Today, for the first time, she had a different idea. Without allowing herself to think too much about the decision, Clara got up and went to the closet. She passed the rows of designer dresses, the shoes that cost thousands of dollars, until she found at the back a box she hadn't opened in months. Inside, carefully folded, were her clothes from before. Faded jeans, a blue cotton blouse she had bought on sale, comfortable sneakers that knew every corner of Brooklyn. Putting on those clothes was like finding a lost version of herself. In the mirror, she didn't see Mrs. Preston Ashford, ornamental wife of a business magnate. She saw Clara Romano, writer, dreamer, woman who once believed that stories had the power to change hearts. Without leaving a note, after all, Preston was rarely home to read them, Clara grabbed her simple brown leather purse and left the penthouse. In the elevator, she breathed deeply for the first time in months, feeling strangely light without the weight of expectations and appearances she constantly carried. The subway ride to Brooklyn was a journey back in time. Clara observed the familiar faces of passengers, real people living real lives, worried about bills and relationships and simple but genuine dreams. A young mother rocked a baby, whispering lullabies in Spanish. An elderly man read a worn book of poetry, his lips moving silently with the words. A teenage couple laughed at something on their phone, their fingers intertwined with the unconscious naturalness of young love. When she got off at Prospect Heights Station, Clara felt a wave of emotion so intense she had to stop and lean against a wall. This was her neighborhood, her world, the place where she had felt alive for the last time. The streets hadn't changed much. The same eclectic mix of restored brownstones and modest apartment buildings, the same vibrant energy of a real community. The Pages and Brew Cafe was still there, nestled between a laundromat and a used bookstore, its familiar red brick facade like a hug from an old friend. Clara paused at the door, looking through the window. It was exactly as she remembered. Mismatched tables, non-matching chairs, walls covered with local art and literary event posters. The smell of strong coffee and creative dreams leaked through the glass. "Clara? Clara Romano?" She turned to find Alex Chen smiling at her, his eyes lighting up with genuine recognition. Alex had been part of her writers' group, a 30-something poet who worked as an English teacher during the day and transformed his observations about urban life into verses that made people cry at open mic nights. "Alex!" The joy in her voice surprised her. "My God, how long has it been?" "Over a year," he said, and there was something in his look that suggested he hadn't forgotten where she had disappeared to, or why. "You look different." Clara looked down, remembering the world she had left behind that morning, the Manhattan penthouse, the silk dresses, the life that felt more like a role she played than an existence she lived. Different how? More polished, more, I don't know, like someone put you in a display case. Alex tilted his head, studying her face. But your eyes are the same, they still have that hunger. Hunger. For stories, for truth, for life worth living. He gestured toward the cafe door. Want to come in? Our group still meets on Wednesdays. Tommy still writes terrible science fiction. Sarah is still working on the same novel after 3 years, and I'm still convinced I can capture the soul of New York in haikus. Clara laughed, a real spontaneous laugh, the kind she hadn't produced in months. That sounds exactly like I remembered. Inside the cafe, it was like stepping into a time machine. The same long-haired barista still worked behind the counter, still made latte art. The same interesting people still occupied the tables, artists scribbling in notebooks, college students debating philosophy, freelancers typing furiously on old laptops. 2 espressos, Alex ordered, guiding Clara to a corner table where they used to sit. Unless you've developed a taste for more sophisticated drinks. Espresso is perfect, Clara said, feeling more like herself with each passing minute. They sat, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Clara could feel Alex processing her transformation, from the expensive clothes she now avoided to the perfectly styled hair that had replaced her natural curls. So, he said finally, how's married life? The question hit her like a gentle dagger. How to explain that she was married but lonelier than she had ever been? How to describe the feeling of sharing a bed with someone who treated her like luxury furniture? Complicated, she admitted. Ah, Alex nodded as if he understood volumes in what she hadn't said. And the writing? Clara looked down at her cup, seeing her distorted reflection in the dark coffee surface. It stopped. So I stopped, or did you stop? The question was shrewd, typical of Alex, who always managed to go straight to the heart of matters. I stopped, she admitted. I can't. The words don't come anymore. It's like I lost my voice. Alex leaned forward, his elbows on the small table. Clara, do you remember what you used to say about writing? What did I say? That writing was like breathing underwater, impossible for most people, but essential for those born with gills. He smiled gently. Maybe the problem isn't that you lost your voice. Maybe it's that you're trying to breathe air when you need to be underwater. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. I don't know where underwater is anymore. Here, Alex said simply, gesturing to the cafe around them. With real people living real problems, feeling real things, not in ivory towers where everything is too beautiful to be true. They spent the next 2 hours talking. About books, about life, about the projects Alex still pursued, with the tireless passion Clara remembered having once. He told her about his students, about the poem he was writing about gentrification, about how he still believed art could change the world, one person at a time. Sarah still has that notebook where we used to do writing exercises, Alex mentioned casually as they finished their coffee. Random prompts, 5-minute challenges. Remember how you used to write those little masterpieces about people you observed on the subway? Clara remembered. She remembered the feeling of words flowing through her fingers like water, of characters coming to life in paragraphs, of stories appearing complete in her mind like unexpected gifts. Wednesday at 7, Alex said, getting up to leave. If you want. No commitment, no pressure. Just come back underwater for a few hours. After he left, Clara remained at the table watching life happen around her. A young couple shared a muffin, feeding each other with the casual intimacy she had forgotten existed. An older woman read poetry aloud to herself, smiling at verses that touched something deep in her soul. A group of college students debated passionately about a movie, each talking over the others, but all clearly engaged and alive. It was real life, raw, imperfect, beautifully messy. And for the first time in 14 months, Clara remembered what it was like to be completely present in her own existence, instead of watching from afar as an elegant but disconnected spectator. When she finally got up to leave, Clara knew something fundamental had changed. She had tasted life again, and the hunger Alex had mentioned, the hunger for stories, for truth, for real connection, was awakening within her like a force that could no longer be ignored. The question was, what would she do with that hunger now that she knew it was still alive? The last straw came on an ordinary Tuesday, disguised as routine. Clara had spent the entire day preparing a special dinner, not because it was an anniversary or celebration, but because she desperately needed something, anything that resembled intimacy. She had bought fresh ingredients at the organic market, chosen the wine Preston had mentioned liking months ago, even put candles on the dining table they rarely used. At 7 p.m., she was sitting at the perfectly set table, watching the candle wax slowly melt while the grilled salmon cooled on the plate. At 8, she put the food away in the refrigerator and blew out the candles. At 9:30, Preston came home. "Sorry, Clara," he said, loosening his tie as he walked directly to his study. "Emergency meeting with the London investors. Did you grab something for dinner?" She stood in the hallway, watching him disappear behind the study door, the familiar sound of keys being typed starting immediately. For one crazy moment, Clara considered knocking on the door, entering without permission, making a scene, demanding that he see her, that he acknowledge she had spent hours preparing something special that was now forgotten in the refrigerator like another wasted gesture. Instead, she went to the bedroom and lay fully dressed on top of the expensive covers, staring at the ceiling as the hours passed. Preston came to bed after midnight, moving silently in the dark, careful not to disturb her. They slept less than 3 feet apart, and might as well have been on different continents. The next morning, Clara woke up with a crystal clarity that frightened her. It wasn't an emotional or impulsive decision. It was the cold, calculated realization that she was slowly dying, one silent day at a time, and that if she didn't do something radical, in a few years, she would be just a beautiful, empty shell, perfectly trained to smile at the right moments and never bother anyone with her feelings. Preston followed his morning routine with Swiss watch precision: shower at 6:15, coffee at 6:45, Asian market review at 7. Clara watched each familiar movement, memorizing it as if it were the last time, which she realized it probably was. "Flying to Boston today," he mentioned casually, checking emails on his phone. "Back tomorrow night." "Okay," Clara replied, her voice sounding normal even while her heart beat like a bird about to fly from an open cage. After Preston left, Clara remained motionless in the kitchen for long minutes, listening to the echo of her own thoughts in the silence that followed. Then, with deliberate movements, she headed to the shared closet. She didn't take much, just the essentials, the things that were truly hers, not the expensive clothes Preston had chosen or the accessories that were part of her trophy wife uniform. She found her old leather suitcase at the back of the closet, the one she had brought from her previous life, and filled it with jeans, t-shirts, books she had tried to read but never managed to finish because her mind was always worried about appearances and social obligations. At the bottom of a drawer she found her old laptop, not the MacBook Pro that Preston had bought for her to use on charity projects, but her old writing companion, marked by years of use and full of stories that had once flowed from her fingers like breath. The hardest part was deciding what to say. Clara sat at the bedroom desk, a beautiful mahogany piece she had never used for anything but storing social event invitations, and tried to find words that would explain the unexplainable. How do you tell someone you're leaving not out of anger, but out of self-preservation? How do you explain it's not about punishment, but about survival? Finally, she wrote, "Preston, I'm not leaving to punish you. I'm leaving so I don't completely disappear. For 14 months I tried to be the wife you needed, elegant, convenient, invisible when necessary. But somewhere in the process, I stopped being myself. I stopped writing, stopped dreaming, stopped believing I deserved to be seen and heard and loved for who I am, not what I represent. You're a good man, Preston. Kind in your way, generous with financial resources, always polite. But we're strangers who share an address, and I can't pretend that's enough anymore. Don't look for me. At least not yet. I need to remember who I was before I became your wife, and that's something I need to do alone. Clara." She folded the note carefully and placed it on Preston's dresser, next to her wedding ring. That simple platinum band that had represented security, not love. The light coming through the window made the metal shine, and Clara felt a pang of something that wasn't exactly regret, but a deep sadness for what could have been if things were different. Clara picked up her purse and suitcase, took one last look at the apartment that had been her golden prison for over a year, and walked toward the door. In the elevator, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, feeling a strange mixture of terror and liberation. When the doors opened on the ground floor, Clara emerged into the world like a woman being reborn, scared, uncertain about the future, but finally, gloriously alive. She had booked a small apartment in Queens through an online ad, a modest studio that cost less in a month than Preston spent on wine in a week. It was tiny compared to the penthouse, but when Clara opened the door and saw sunlight streaming through the single window, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. In the days that followed, Clara rediscovered small pleasures she had forgotten: shopping at a market where she had to check prices, cooking simple meals in a closet-sized kitchen, sitting on the fire escape that served as her makeshift balcony, watching real life happen on the streets below. And for the first time in 14 months, she wrote, not polished stories about perfect people in idealized situations, but raw, honest words about loneliness and discovery, about a woman learning to love herself enough to choose authenticity over convenience. It was real life, imperfect and beautiful, and Clara was finally living it instead of just watching from afar. 3 days after she left, her phone started ringing. Preston Ashford had built his entire adult life on the unshakable foundation of routine. Wake up at 6 a.m., Asian markets, strong coffee, calculated decisions that moved millions of dollars with the coldness of someone who had learned that emotions were dangerous luxuries in the business world. For 14 months, Clara had been part of that routine, a constant and comforting presence, like the almost imperceptible hum of the air conditioning or the familiar weight of his Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. That's why, when he returned from Boston on Thursday night and found only silence where there should have been at least the soft sound of television or the familiar noise of Clara moving through the kitchen, his first reaction was confusion, not alarm. "Clara," he called, dropping his suitcase in the entrance hall with the same economical gesture as always. "I'm home." Silence. Preston frowned, checking his watch. 8:15. She should be there. Clara was always there when he arrived, a constant in his life as predictable as sunrise. Maybe she was sleeping or in the bath or talking on the phone with her mother. It was only when he went up to the bedroom and saw the note folded on his dresser, next to the small platinum circle he had placed on her finger 14 months before, that reality hit him like a punch to the stomach. The first lines of the note seemed written in a foreign language. His brain, trained to process complex reports and intricate financial analyses, refused to comprehend the simple words Clara had left for him. "I'm not leaving to punish you. I'm leaving so I don't completely disappear." Preston sat heavily on the edge of the bed, reading the note a second time, then a third. Each word was like a shocking revelation about a world that had existed right next to his, but which he had never really seen. "For 14 months I tried to be the wife you needed. Elegant, convenient, invisible when necessary." Invisible? Preston blinked, confused. Clara wasn't invisible. She was always there, always perfectly put together, always ready for social events, always. The realization came slowly, like cold water rising up his chest. When was the last time he had really asked how Clara had spent her day? When was the last time he had noticed if she seemed sad or happy or tired? When was the last time he had looked at her, really looked, instead of simply confirming she was where he expected her to be? We're strangers who share an address. Preston felt something strange happen in his chest, a tightness he couldn't identify. He stood abruptly, as if movement could disperse the discomfort, and began walking through the apartment. That's when he started noticing things. The dining table was set for two: elegant plates, silver cutlery, 2 wine glasses. There were remnants of melted candles in the candlesticks. In the refrigerator, he found an elaborate dinner carefully stored in containers, untouched. Tuesday. She had prepared a special dinner on Tuesday, and he had arrived late, mumbling distracted apologies before locking himself in the study until after midnight. How many other occasions like this had he missed? How many silent gestures of love or attempts at connection had he ignored without even noticing? Preston picked up the phone with fingers that trembled imperceptibly, a phenomenon that would have alarmed him under any other circumstances, because Preston Ashford never trembled. He called Clara's number, listening to the rings echo in emptiness until voicemail answered. "Clara, it's me. Please call me back. We need to talk." He hung up and immediately called again. "Clara, I read your note. I don't understand. I understand you're upset, but we can work this out. Please come home so we can talk like adults." On the third call, His voice began to crack. "Please, just tell me where you are. I'm worried." Clara didn't return the calls. In the days that followed, Preston discovered that Clara's absence was like the absence of gravity. Something you never notice until it's suddenly not there anymore, and then everything you thought was solid and predictable starts floating in unexpected directions. The penthouse, which had always been a sanctuary of order and elegance, now felt like a mausoleum. The silence was no longer peace, but oppression. The mornings lost their comforting rhythm. There was no more soft sound of Clara moving through the kitchen, no more familiar scent of her perfume lingering in the air, no more silent but constant presence that had become the backdrop of his daily life. Preston tried to maintain his routine, but discovered that routines built around two people quickly crumble when one of them disappears. He made coffee for two out of habit, set out 2 cups before remembering. He automatically checked if Clara was ready before leaving for social events, only to find an empty apartment and the echo of his own footsteps. It was Friday night, sitting alone in the dining room, with a meal bought from an expensive restaurant that tasted like nothing, that Preston finally admitted to himself a truth he had avoided for 4 days. He missed her. Not just the convenience of her presence or the way she complimented his public image, but her, Clara, the woman who laughed softly when reading books, who always smelled like flowers and something indefinably comforting, who greeted him every morning with a genuine smile, even when he barely looked up from his phone. The realization hit him with a force that left him breathless. He had spent 14 months living alongside an extraordinary woman and had treated her like luxury furniture. Saturday morning, Preston did something he hadn't done in years. He cancelled all work commitments. Instead of going to the office, he stayed in the apartment, wandering through the rooms like a ghost in his own life, trying to reconstruct memories of moments he had missed by being too physically present only. He found a notebook that Clara had left behind, hidden in a desk drawer. The pages were filled with story beginnings, poem fragments, observations about life that revealed an emotional depth and insight he had never bothered to discover. One entry, dated just a month earlier, made him stop breathing. "Today, Preston looked at me during breakfast. Really looked, not just confirmed I was there. For a moment I thought he would say something, that he would ask about the book I was reading or about plans for the day. But then the phone rang, and the moment faded like steam. Sometimes I wonder if he would notice if I gradually disappeared, a little each day, until there was nothing left but a vague impression that something was missing." Preston closed the notebook with visibly trembling hands now. Clara hadn't left on a whim or female drama, as he had initially assumed. She had left because she was literally disappearing, and he had been too blind, too busy, too emotionally absent to notice. That's when he made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. For the first time in his career, Preston Ashford was going to ask for help with something he couldn't solve with spreadsheets or business strategies. He needed to find his wife, and when he found her, he needed to learn how to love her before it was too late. It took 3 days of desperate phone calls, discreet private investigation, and finally a humiliating visit to Clara's best friend for Preston to discover where she was. Nena Martinez had been skeptical from the first moment, watching the impeccably dressed man who showed up at her door in Brooklyn, as if he were an exotic species that had gotten lost from the zoo. "She doesn't want to talk to you," Nena had said, crossing her arms over her chest with the fierce protection of a friend who had consoled Clara through nights of silent tears over the past months. "Please," Preston had begged, and the word sounded strange in his mouth. When was the last time he had begged for anything? "I just need 5 minutes. 5 minutes to explain." "Explain what?" Nena had shot back. "How you spent 14 months treating my best friend like expensive wallpaper." The truth in Nena's words had cut deeper than any business criticism Preston had ever received, but something in his genuine desperation must have touched her, because she finally whispered, "Penn Station, 3:47 train to Philadelphia." "But Preston, if you hurt her again, I'll personally make sure you regret it." Now Preston was running through Penn Station like a man possessed, his Armani suit wrinkled, hair disheveled for the first time in decades, desperately searching for a familiar face among hundreds of strangers. His breathing was irregular. When was the last time he had run? And he could feel sweat forming under the expensive shirt he had chosen so carefully that morning, thinking appearances mattered. Appearances didn't matter. Nothing mattered except finding Clara before she disappeared from his life forever. He saw her near platform 7, sitting in a plastic chair with a small suitcase at her feet. Not the Louis Vuitton luggage he had bought her, but an old brown leather suitcase that must have seen years of travel. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of the sophisticated hairstyle he had grown accustomed to seeing. She looked younger this way, more herself, more the woman he had married but never really known. Clara. She looked up, and Preston saw surprise, then pain, then tired resignation pass across her features. Preston, how did you find me? Nena. He approached slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might flee at any sudden movement. Please don't get on that train. Clara sighed, a long, sad exhalation. Preston, we already talked about this, or tried to. Actually, I tried to talk. You had more important calls. There are no calls more important than you. The words came out with an urgency that surprised him. Clara, I read your note. I read it about 50 times, and you're right, about everything. I treated you like furniture. I ignored you. I didn't even know what color your eyes were until last night, when I was looking at a photo of us and really paid attention for the first time. Clara blinked, tears beginning to form. Brown, she whispered. They're brown with little gold flecks. Brown with gold flecks, Preston repeated, memorizing. Like how you take your coffee. No sugar, just a drop of cream. How you bite your bottom lip when you're concentrating while reading. How you always leave a bookmark exactly in the middle of the book, even when you're only on page 10. Clara stared at him, shock replacing resignation. You noticed those things? I noticed everything, Preston said, his voice breaking. I just never really paid attention, and that's unforgivable. The announcement echoed through the station. Train to Philadelphia, platform 7, boarding in 10 minutes. Clara stood up, picking up her suitcase. Preston, I can't do this anymore. I can't be invisible in my own life anymore. You weren't invisible, Preston said desperately, then stopped, forcing himself to be honest. You were invisible to me, and that makes me the biggest idiot in the world, because you're extraordinary, Clara. You're kind and intelligent and funny, and when you smile and really smile, not those polite smiles at events, it's like the whole world gets brighter. Clara stopped, suitcase in hand, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Why are you saying these things now? Why not 14 months ago when I was begging for any sign that you saw me as a real person? Preston took a deep breath, knowing he had to tell the complete truth, no matter how much it hurt. Because I was scared. Because 7 years ago I lost my wife and little daughter in a car accident. Sarah was 32, Emma was only 4. I loved them so much that when they died, I thought I was going to die too. Clara dropped her suitcase, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Preston, you never told me. I made rules after that, he continued, his voice choked. Rules to never allow myself to love like that again, to never become vulnerable enough that losing someone could completely destroy me. I thought I could have a civilized, respectful, safe marriage. I thought I could maintain emotional distance and still be a good husband. But you can't love at a distance, Clara whispered. No, Preston admitted. And you made me feel again, Clara. Even when I was desperately trying not to feel. The way you cared about me, how you tried to include me in small moments, how you looked at me like I was someone worth knowing. It terrified me. Clara took a step toward him, and Preston could see dawning understanding in her eyes. So, you pulled away. I pulled away, he confirmed, and I almost lost the most important person who's entered my life since Sarah and Emma. The second announcement. Final call for the train to Philadelphia. Clara, Preston said, his voice barely a desperate whisper. I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know I spent 14 months proving I'm a terrible husband, but if you'll give me the opportunity, just one opportunity, I'll spend the rest of my life learning how to love you the way you deserve to be loved. Clara was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking. Preston, he took a step closer, then another, until he was close enough to see the little gold flecks in her brown eyes. You said you weren't leaving to punish me, but so you wouldn't completely disappear. Well, I understand now, because these last 4 days without you have been like disappearing. And I don't want to disappear, Clara. I want to live. I want to really live with you. He raised a trembling hand, gently touching her face, his fingers tracing the line of tears on her cheek. You are completely, absolutely loved, he whispered, echoing words he had once dreamed of saying and truly meaning. Please don't leave. Please let me prove I can be the man you deserve. Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch like a flower seeking sun. When she opened them again, Preston saw something that made his heart race. Hope. Do you promise? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Promise you'll see me. Really see me. I promise, Preston said, and then he did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He leaned down and kissed his wife. It was a kiss filled with 14 months of unspoken words, lost chances, love that had existed but never been properly nurtured. It was desperate and tender at the same time, loaded with promises and possibilities. Clara melted into him, her hands clutching his shirt as if he were an anchor in a storm. When they separated, both were breathing irregularly, foreheads touching, world reduced to just the two of them in the middle of the train station chaos. Come home with me, Preston whispered against her lips. Come home and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you're the most precious thing in my world. Clara nodded through her tears, and Preston knew he was receiving the most precious gift of his life, a second chance to get love right. They didn't return to the Manhattan penthouse. The idea emerged silently as they left Penn Station, fingers intertwined like teenagers discovering first love, both knowing they needed a neutral space to rebuild what had been broken. Preston stopped a taxi and murmured an address that Clara didn't recognize, a discreet boutique hotel in Midtown, away from the memories of glacial silences and wasted dinners. I don't want us to go back to that apartment yet, Preston said quietly as the taxi navigated through traffic. I want to start fresh, just the two of us, without the shadows of who we were when we didn't know how to love each other. Clara nodded, understanding perfectly. The penthouse was full of ghosts, of her gradually disappearing, of him too busy to notice. They needed a clean place, without history, where they could discover who they were when they were truly present with each other. The room was simple but elegant. King-size bed with pristine white sheets, windows offering a view of the city pulsing below, soft light filtering through linen curtains. When the door closed behind them, a different kind of silence settled. Not the suffocating silence of months of emotional distance, but the expectant silence of two people who knew they were on the verge of something transformative. Clara remained near the window, suddenly nervous. 14 months of marriage, and she felt like a virgin on her wedding night, not because they had never shared physical intimacy, but because they had never shared true emotional intimacy. All the previous times had been polite transactions, fulfillment of conjugal duties without the real surrender of hearts. Clara, Preston said softly, approaching slowly, as he had done at the station. Look at me. She turned, and what she saw in his eyes took her breath away. It wasn't the distant, controlled look she knew, but something raw and vulnerable, and completely focused on her. For the first time in over a year, Preston Ashford was truly present, not physically, but emotionally present, his entire being concentrated on the woman before him. You're trembling, he observed, raising a hand to gently touch her face. I'm nervous, Clara admitted, leaning into his touch. It's strange, isn't it, being nervous with my own husband? It's not strange, Preston murmured, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence she had never felt before. We are strangers in many ways, but I want to know you, Clara. I want to know every thought, every dream, every little detail that makes you, you. He moved closer, until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, the familiar scent of his aftershave mixed with something else, anxiety perhaps, or anticipation. His hands found her waist, resting there with a hesitation that spoke of a man asking permission instead of assuming rights. May I? He asked, and the question carried the weight of all the consent he had never sought, all the connections he had let slip away. Yes, Clara whispered, and the word came out loaded with 14 months of emotional hunger, of nights sleeping next to someone who had never really touched her. The kiss this time was different from the desperate one at the station. It was exploration and discovery. Preston taking time to memorize the shape of her lips, the way she sighed softly when he deepened the kiss, how her hands clutched his shirt as if she feared he might disappear. "You're so beautiful," he murmured against her lips, the words sounding like a prayer. "How could I not see how absolutely stunning you are?" Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief so deep it was almost painful. "Preston." "Shh," he whispered, kissing the tears from her cheeks. "Let me show you how much you mean to me. Let me love you the way I should have loved you from the first day." His hands found the buttons of her blouse, but moved with a deliberate slowness that spoke of a man savoring every moment. Clara watched his face as he undressed her, the intense concentration, the way his eyes softened every time they met hers, as if he were constantly making sure she was present, willing, wanting. When the blouse slipped from her shoulders, Preston stopped, simply looking at her with an admiration that made Clara feel like a work of art being appreciated for the first time. "You're perfect," he said, voice hoarse with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." Clara raised her own hands to the buttons of his shirt, her fingers trembling slightly. "My turn to see you," she murmured, and Preston remained perfectly still while she undressed him, letting her discover the body of the man she had shared a bed with, but never really explored. When they were skin against skin, Preston gently guided her to the bed, his hands never ceasing to touch, tracing her shoulders, memorizing the curve of her waist, discovering small marks and imperfections that told the story of her life before him. "Tell me," he said, kissing a small scar on her shoulder. "Fell off my bike when I was 8, Clara laughed softly, then sighed when he kissed the spot again. "I cried more over the ice cream I dropped than the injury. And this," his lips found a birthmark on her rib. "I always hated it when I was little. My mother used to say they were angel fingerprints from when they formed me." Preston raised his head to look into her eyes. "Your mother was right. You were formed by angels." It was conversation and discovery and worship all at once, Preston treating every part of her like sacred territory to be explored with reverence. When they finally joined, it was with an intimacy that transcended the physical. Eyes locked on each other, breaths mingling, bodies moving in perfect harmony of two people finally, completely present. "Clara." Preston sighed her name like a mantra, like a prayer, like the most important word he had ever spoken. "My Clara, I'm here," she whispered back, hands framing his face, forcing him to maintain eye contact even in the most intense moments. "I'm here, and you're here, and we're real." Afterward, they remained intertwined in the white sheets, the city glowing through the windows like a silent witness to their reconciliation. Preston traced lazy patterns on Clara's bare skin, stopping occasionally to kiss a shoulder or whisper words of adoration into her hair. "I don't want this night to end," he confessed, voice low in the room's dimness. "I'm afraid that if we sleep, I'll wake up and find out this was a dream." Clara turned in his arms so she could look into his eyes. "It wasn't a dream. We're real, Preston. This connection is real, and it won't disappear because you finally decided to be present for it." "How can you be sure?" he asked, raw vulnerability in his voice. Clara smiled, touching his face with gentle fingers. "Because now I know you see me, really see me, and once you learn to see someone, truly see them, you can't pretend they're invisible anymore." Preston captured her hand, kissing her palm. "You're right. I'll never treat you as invisible again. I'll never take anything for granted again. You're the most precious gift I've ever received, and I almost wasted it completely." "Almost," Clara agreed, nestling closer. "But you didn't waste it. We're still here. We're still here," Preston repeated, and in the words there was promise, gratitude, and the beginning of a love that finally had permission to grow without fear or reservations. Outside, the city never slept, but inside the hotel room, two hearts that had been lost to each other finally found their way back home. 6 months later, Clara woke on a Sunday morning with golden light filtering through curtains she had chosen herself, not the heavy silk drapes a decorator had selected to match the penthouse aesthetic, but simple cream-colored linen that let natural light dance through the rooms like visual music. The difference was more than decorative, it was philosophical. It was the difference between living in a display case and living in a home. "Good morning, beautiful," came Preston's familiar voice, but there was a quality in it that still surprised her even after months. Genuine tenderness, a warmth that transformed simple words into verbal caresses. Clara turned to find him watching her with that expression she had learned to recognize and treasure. Complete focus, total presence, as if she were the most fascinating thing in the universe. In the first days after their reconciliation, she sometimes tested this attention, looking for signs that he was forcing it, faking interest. But time had proven that Preston's transformation was genuine. He had learned the art of being present, and he practiced it with the same dedication he had once reserved only for business. "Good morning," she replied, stretching languidly. "What time is it?" 9:15. "You slept in late, which means you were writing past midnight again." There was a note of gentle pride in his voice that still made Clara's heart race. "How's the new book coming?" Clara smiled, thinking of the manuscript growing steadily on her desk. Not the formal mahogany writing desk she had never used, but a simple wooden table that Preston had found at an antique market in Brooklyn, insisting she choose exactly what she wanted for her writing space. "Good, really good, actually." She sat up, pulling her knees to her chest. "It's strange, writing about love, when I finally know what it really feels like." Preston moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed and extending a cup of coffee, prepared exactly how she liked it. A discovery he had made not through distant observation, but by asking directly, paying attention, remembering. "Tell me about the story," he said, and Clara knew he was genuinely interested, not just making polite conversation. "It's about a woman who gets lost trying to be who others need her to be," Clara explained, taking a sip of the perfect coffee, "and about a man who's so busy building walls to protect his heart that he doesn't notice when someone special is trying to reach him." "Sounds familiar," Preston said with the self-deprecating smile she had learned to love. "Happy ending?" "I'm still writing it, but yes, definitely a happy ending, because sometimes people can learn, sometimes they can change, and sometimes true love is worth fighting for." Preston kissed her temple, a gesture so natural now that Clara could barely remember when he had to think before touching her. "Speaking of fighting for things that are worth it, there's a surprise for you downstairs." Clara raised an eyebrow. "What kind of surprise?" "The kind that involves the foundation we discussed, and maybe some special visitors." Curiosity piqued, Clara dressed quickly and followed Preston to the living room, which they had completely redecorated over the past months. Now there were plants everywhere. Not formal flower arrangements changed twice a week, but real plants that they watered together, that grew and sometimes died and needed to be replaced, that made the space alive instead of perfect. The walls now displayed real photographs, not expensive abstract art chosen by decorators, but images that told their stories. Clara and Preston at their remarriage ceremony in Central Park, surrounded by real friends instead of business associates. Clara's family visiting for the first time, her mother clearly emotional but trying to hide her impression of the apartment. Preston and Clara covered in paint during a weekend when they decided to paint her study together. "Clara!" Her mother's voice made her turn sharply. Maria Romano was sitting on the sofa, radiant with health. The treatments had worked better than anyone had dared hope. Chatting animatedly with two women Clara didn't immediately recognize. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Clara hugged her mother, confused but delighted. "Preston brought me as a surprise," Maria explained, her eyes shining with obvious approval. "And he wanted you to meet some special people." Preston approached, wrapping his arm around Clara's waist with the naturalness of a man who had learned that public affection wasn't weakness, but strength. "Clara, I want to introduce you to Sarah Martinez and Jennifer Chen. They run literacy programs in Harlem and Queens, respectively." Clara greeted the women, still confused about the purpose of the meeting, until Preston continued, "They're here to discuss the Clara Romano Foundation for Literacy and Creative Arts." The world stopped. Clara stared at Preston, then at the two smiling women, then at her mother, who was clearly in on something she wasn't. "The what?" "You mentioned months ago that you wanted to do something meaningful," Preston explained, unusual nervousness in his voice. "Something that combined your passion for writing with helping others discover their voices. So, I started researching, and I found out there's a desperate need for programs that don't just teach people to read, but that help them find their own stories, their own voices. Sarah Martinez leaned forward. Mrs. Ashford, your husband told us about your writing background, about your passion for storytelling. What we're proposing is revolutionary, not just literacy classes, but creative writing workshops, programs that help people process trauma through storytelling, initiatives that give voice to the voiceless. It would be your project, Jennifer added. Your vision, your leadership. We provide the community connections and education expertise. You bring the creative vision and passion. Clara felt tears beginning to form. For months, she had felt grateful for the return of her marriage, for rediscovering love, but there was a part of her that still longed for purpose beyond personal happiness. I don't know what to say. Say yes, her mother murmured. My daughter always had a gift with words. I always knew that one day she would help others find their voices too. Clara looked at Preston, seeing pride and nervousness mixed in his expression. You really did this. Created a foundation for me. I created the legal and financial structure, Preston corrected, but its soul, its heart, that's all you, Clara. It's who you are, what you're meant to do. 3 hours later, after Sarah and Jennifer had left with concrete plans and timelines and contagious excitement about possibilities, after her mother had returned to Brooklyn with a promise to come back the following week for dinner, Clara and Preston were alone in the kitchen, preparing a simple lunch together. I can't believe you did this, Clara said for the 10th time, still processing. An entire foundation. You deserve to have something that's entirely yours, Preston replied, chopping vegetables with the careful precision he brought to everything now. Something that feeds your soul the way business feeds mine. Clara stopped stirring the soup and watched him. Preston, I love you. The words came out simply, naturally, but carried the weight of everything they'd been through. Not just grateful, not just happy. I love you. The man you became, the way you see me, the way you make me feel like I could conquer the world. Preston put down his knife and turned to face her completely. Clara Romano Ashford, he said, using both her names like a vow. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Not just because you saved me from a life of emotional emptiness, but because you showed me what it means to be truly alive. He pulled her into his arms, and they stood there in the kitchen with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows, surrounded by the beautiful mess of a life being lived fully. Books scattered on the counter, plants that needed watering, photos on the refrigerator, evidence everywhere of two people who had learned how to love each other properly. You know what's funny? Clara murmured against his chest. What? When I left, I thought I was giving up on love. I thought I was choosing loneliness over invisibility, but actually I was making space for real love to find us. Preston tightened his embrace. Sometimes you have to lose something to learn how precious it is. And sometimes, Clara added, you have to be brave enough to ask for what you deserve. Later that evening, after dinner and long conversations about foundation plans and dreams for the future, Clara sat at her writing desk, not hiding in a corner, but stationed prominently in the living room where Preston could see her when he worked on his laptop nearby, where they could share comfortable silences and occasional comments. She was writing the final chapter of her novel, the story that had become their story in many ways. As she typed the last lines, Preston looked up from his own work. Finishing tonight? He asked. Yeah. Final sentence. Read it to me? Clara smiled, appreciating that he wanted to be part of even this small moment. And as she looked into his eyes, really looked, the way she'd been longing for him to look at her, she realized that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about imperfect people learning how to see each other clearly, completely, courageously. Preston was quiet for a moment. Then, that's beautiful. Is it about us? It's about anyone who's ever felt invisible. Anyone who's ever loved someone who wasn't ready to love back. Anyone who's ever been brave enough to walk away and then brave enough to try again when the person they love finally learns how to see them. Preston closed his laptop and moved to kneel beside her chair. Clara? Yes? Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for being brave enough to leave and patient enough to come back. Thank you for teaching me how to love someone properly. Clara touched his face, marveling at how different this felt from their early days. How present he was, how connected, how genuine. You know what I realized? What? Sometimes the person you're meant to be with is the person you're already with. You just both need to grow into who you're supposed to be together. Preston stood and pulled her up with him. Come to bed with me, Mrs. Ashford. Not because it's expected or convenient or part of our routine, but because I want to fall asleep next to the woman I love and wake up tomorrow excited to see what new ways I can show her how cherished she is. Clara laughed, the sound filling their home with joy. Now that's what I call a proper proposal. And as they walked together toward their bedroom, not the sterile space it had once been, but a room full of shared books and comfortable silences and morning conversations and the kind of intimacy that comes from truly seeing each other, Clara knew that this was what happiness looked like. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real and present and full of love that had been tested and chose to grow stronger. Outside, Manhattan glittered with 8 million stories, but inside their redecorated penthouse, two hearts that had almost missed each other entirely were finally, completely, home. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't in leaving, but in staying and fighting for what can be transformed. Clara discovered that true love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about two imperfect people who choose to grow together. Preston learned that being present isn't just about sharing a space, but about sharing a completely open heart. In the end, they realized that the best loves are those that teach us who we really are, and then love us exactly for that. Because sometimes, all someone needs is to be seen. If this story touched your heart, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, click the Worth It button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us continue bringing stories like this.